Greetings, fellow cucks, snowflakes, soy boys, and Antifa super soldiers, and welcome to I Don't Speak German, the podcast in which I get Daniel Harper, internet lefty person, and my friend and colleague, to tell me what he learned and heard during more than 2 years of listening to and reading what the alt-right, which is really the far right, say to each other in their safe spaces, their podcasts, their YouTube videos, etc.
We're going to be tackling a single subject per episode, and this first episode is about Richard Spencer. We're going to be discussing racists and racism and fascism generally, so trigger warnings definitely apply.
Okay, first question. How would you define what you've been researching, Daniel?
To sort of the casual listeners, normies, I would say broadly the alt-right, although alt-right is not a term that I like to use very much.
Why not?
Because it's really nebulous. It means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It's kind of intentionally that. It's kind of always served that purpose. In fact, I mean, I think we'll kind of get into sort of the origins of the term here in a second. But, there's no really clear definition that's sort of universally applicable as to like who is and is not alt-right. And most of the figures who even kind of work within that kind of broad movement will sort of like define themselves relative to this term, or they will kind of like say, oh, I'm not alt-right, because they're meaning it to mean, kind of one particular, definition of it. Well, yeah, it's just really, it's not a clear term, and so I try not to use it. And there are other kind of like subgroups within what is kind of broadly called the alt-right, who, I try to more use sort of their, terms and kind of like how they define themselves as being slightly more clear, or at least, not as prone to misuse as alt-right. I mean, a dissident right or nationalist right or, just far right, hard right, all kinds of various terms that, kind of work for different sort of factions within that. One thing that I do want to make clear is that there's one distinction that I will make, and that is the alt-light versus alt-right distinction. And I really spend very little time with sort of the alt-light figures. These are your kind of InfoWars, Paul Joseph Watsons, Milo, like those kinds of figures.
Sargon,
who I don't think even we could talk about whether Sargon is even alt-light, by that standard. He would probably not refer to himself as such, but
sure it would.
Yeah, a lot of those figures. I mean, alt-light is also kind of alt-light is more of a style that it's sort of like, we're gonna push these sort of right-wing anti SJW quote unquote talking points, and kind of put this fairly straightforward kind of like right-wing conservatism, at least in the U.S. It's basically Republican talking points, but we're going to do it in kind of a snarky, in-your-face way, and we call ourselves, and we're the alt-light, and therefore we're not your dad's conservatism, because we'll use the swear words that they won't, etc. So the people that I spend my time with, that I've really spent my time studying and kind of learning, are the explicitly sort of race realist, ethno-nationalist, white nationalist right, who kind of gird their arguments in kind of pseudoscience and sociobiology and evolutionary psychology, and who use those kinds of explicitly racial arguments. Because that's really come to the forefront. It's really come to a popularity, and it infects the whole discourse, I think, online. I mean, it has for the last 4 or 5 years now, and that side of it, I think, just sort of interested me more than sort of the alt-light, than sort of the Milo figures. Just in terms of like, it feels like there's a little bit more of sort of an intellectual or pseudo-intellectual, I put everything in quotes here, but there is a little bit more of a sort of like an argument that you can push against there. But also the fact that, we are sort of seeing people embrace more and more of this sort of really, really far racist rhetoric, and it's infecting more and more our just sort of traditional politics and sort of our traditional, just sort of stuff that's just in the air, and the way that works, the way that sort of online culture and meme culture and social media have enabled this to just sort of spread like wildfire until the president of the United States can spread white genocide conspiracy theories, and it's just sort of a thing that happens. That's the stuff that really interests me. That's the stuff that scares me, and kind of that's where I've really put most of my focus. So again, I spend very little time with someone like Milo. Is more just like kind of a figure of fun for me. The people I follow are mostly people who are, again, that kind of explicitly kind of ethno-nationalist, white nationalist right.
Right. Not. I don't want to get sidetracked into the alt-right because as you say, it's not your focus, but that is kind of the vector, or one of the vectors whereby this more hard right fringe that you've been investigating has had that kind of influence, isn't it? I mean, particularly, right. I'm thinking of Bannon and Breitbart and so on.
Well,
and that's Milo as well, of course, isn't it?
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and this again kind of gets into the kind of the question of where's the dividing line here, and to me, I have a pretty clear like kind of thing in my head of like there are these people who are spreading kind of the explicitly race realist stuff, and then there are people sort of hiding that, but who clearly are kind of working on the same assumptions, and then there are people who are not, and who are kind of pushing more kind of like Trumpist, more straightforwardly just kind of Republican, right-wing kind of stuff. Even though they may be very far right on, like, for instance, anti-transphobia. And let me be clear, I don't approve of any of these people. But I do see there being a difference between this sort of like coded implicit racism of talking about states' rights versus actually wanting to push all the black people into their own like ghetto, into their own country or something. It's a very different kind of thing if you've been looking at sort of the history of American politics in the last 80 years or so. The fact that this is now just sort of fairly mainstream rhetoric in a lot of places, and particularly online, and in that people are being radicalized to this. You see teenagers who are just who just don't believe the Holocaust because it's just been mocked too many times in their presence. It's just sort of like, oh, that's just like nobody believes in the Holocaust because like that's just the way that's just where they've come in, and that's really scary.
Yeah. Well, maybe maybe another time we'll get into.
We'll definitely have to talk about the Holocaust. I am not prepared today to spend too much time talking about like kind of where that comes from, but it's a very prominent example, for instance.
No, I do want to get onto that, and as I say, maybe at some point we'll get onto the way in which this hard right fringe that you've been looking at sort of reaches out through these more disguised versions into the mainstream. But as you say, I mean, I'm sort of emphasizing the fuzzy spectrum. You're emphasizing the hard distinction, and I think that's just as valuable, if not at a certain point politically more valuable. So let's focus in on that. One figure who's been very much a sort of a nexus figure between the two, or has tried to position himself that way, and who's very well known, is of course Richard Spencer. So tell me about Richard Spencer.
Sure. Well, Richard Spencer is definitely alt-right. He is actually to the degree that this thing has a definite origin point. It is actually not technically with Spencer himself. It's was a speech given by a guy named Paul Gottfried. Now, Paul Gottfried is still alive. He does not claim the term alternative right, but at a speech at the H.L. Mencken Club during I think Thanksgiving weekend of 2008, he gave a speech called "The Decline and Rise of the Alternative Right." This was sort of reproduced in Tacky's Mag, which was edited by Richard Spencer at the time, and Richard Spencer was also editing at the American Conservative. And these are kind of paleo-conservative, paleo-libertarian magazines. And if you read the actual thing, I can send you the link. You can put it in the show notes. It's actually kind of a tough read unless you sort of like understand the context in which it's given, because he's very Gottfried is very much this sort of old man of the of the paleocons. Some people actually say he coined the term paleoconservative back in the 80s, although I haven't seen kind of a really concrete reference for that. But he is widely credited with coining both the term paleoconservative and alternative right. Now, the reason it becomes associated with Richard Spencer is that Spencer A is both kind of editing at Tacky's Mag and American Conservative, but he kind of like takes it and kind of makes it his own. He founds AlternativeRight.com, just a website, like basically a blogspot blog, a few months later, and then eventually kind of shortens it to alt-right, and makes it, does altright.com and starts like actually kind of doing events, giving speeches with that kind of banner, and kind of made that term into a kind of defined political thing. But if you read the speech that Gottfried gave, it's very much kind of about a reaction, a rejection of movement conservatism of the kind of like basically of the kind of the Reagan and Bush years, from say, if you want to say like kind of the mid 70s to what was at the time current 2008. Basically kind of the failures of this kind of neoconservative style of politics. And, really, if you kind of read between the lines, it's very clear that like the war in Iraq went really badly, and the kind of conservative movement was kind of scrambling to see what they were going to do next, and really kind of gave, this kind of vacuum, this power vacuum, or this sort of ideological vacuum, this really kind of gave power to this kind of like rising movement of that the paleocons could kind of like take back over, just because Bush was so hated even within the Republican Party, and again, largely not. I mean, it's amazing that 60 million people voted for George W. Bush, and I can't find a single one of them anywhere. It's amazing. But yeah, no, you see in this piece, and again, you can link to it if you want. I can give you the link, but it is very much about kind of a rejection of this particular kind of conservatism and this particular kind of the endless wars, the kind of like spreading democracy around the world and kind of fighting communism abroad and that sort of thing. And in that sense, what's interesting about Spencer then is that he was very much kind of in this paleoconservative, but sort of not in sort of the core of the conservative like Republican Party. He wasn't being groomed for like kind of high up positions, but certainly within this sort of like this smaller world. They're kind of outside of the warm fires of sort of the neoconservative think tank money. So, but there was definitely some, he was definitely one of those blue bloods. He was definitely one of those people being groomed for this kind of position. And it's interesting that he's, I have a video. It was actually on C-SPAN of, a Ron Paul event at what was called the Robert Taft Club.
Yeah.
Which was
came
founder,
up in my research as well.
Yeah, no, and again, I can give you this link. I've got it in front of me. I kind of rewatched, but Richard Spencer actually introduces Ron Paul on, let's see, it's October 11th, 2007. So this is when Ron Paul is sort of doing the, his Ron Paul 08 run for president, which
Ron
becomes
Paul Revolution.
The Ron Paul Revolution, right? And Richard Spencer's right there. And you look at him here. I mean, he's I guess he's like 28 or so, and very looks. I mean, you can tell the difference that the kind of 13 years or so, or 12 years or so has made in terms of the lines on his face. He definitely looks like kind of a more callow youth at this point. But it's amazing how much he still kind of sounds exactly like he sounds today. But he's definitely sort of hiding certain views. He's not going out nearly as far as he would on sort of like a sort of a right-wing podcast, an alt-right podcast today, but he's and he's kind of towing the line out of respect, I think, for Ron Paul, and out of respect for trying to kind of keep access to those institutions.
Well, ironically, that's what Ron Paul's doing as well. But
exactly, and and ironically, Spencer. I mean, again, I just rewatched this a few minutes ago, just his little introduction, And I mean, it's entirely about sort of the failures of foreign policy, and he's kind of making jokes and like about the other sort of Republicans that were running in that primary campaign at the time and stuff that probably I'd have to go look up some of the references, some of the jokes. I'm like, I don't even remember that incident, but like apparently it was current at the time. But it's fascinating to look at him then and see just how completely he's just kind of one of these kind of up and coming people. And within 2 years, he's kind of founding this alternative right movement, and he's kind of going off. And he starts up a campus speaking tour in like 2010. He's doing a ton of speaking at events. He did a big event at Vanderbilt with like 300 people in attendance, just kind of talking against affirmative action and kind of doing that, spreading this this kind of idea that affirmative action is quote unquote anti-white, which was this kind of term. He's using the terminology that was kind of on that far right wing of the paleoconservatives. He's still kind of in that headspace, but he's still kind of part of that movement, but he's kind of pushing at the further right fringes of that, because the paleocons, there are some sort of quote unquote white nationalist thinkers who are kind of included within that sort of paleocon label. But the movement itself, even the paleocons, really didn't want anything to do with sort of open white nationalism. And if you went too far from them, then you kind of ended up being in kind of like the the third party hell, this hellscape, and you couldn't get any kind of money or any kind of institutional support. And so at this point, certainly when he's introducing Ron Paul, he's still thoroughly ensconced within this blue blood world of blazers and ties, and we're going to talk about conservatism and foreign policy, etc.
So he's still at that point thinking of a maybe not entirely fully ensconced inside the mainstream, but a basically mainstream adjacent, respectable political career. Do you think?
Yeah, I mean he's basically kind of looking to be some kind of, I don't know, maybe he's trying. It's funny that Richard Spencer is someone that I really go back and forth a lot on, exactly how I feel about like what he's done and who he is and what he's really been like, what's really going on behind his eyes, what's in Richard Spencer's head and what's his meaning. Because, when I first started approaching these topics in late 2016, and I first started really kind of like listening to these guys and kind of following the movement, I kind of thought Richard Spencer was just more the PR guy, At that point, I never really felt like he was kind of pushing the memes and pushing the ideology and kind of pushing, that the movement was really his. It always struck me as he was just kind of the guy that cleaned up real nice, that you could put in front of an NPR microphone and give him 5 minutes, and he'll do a pretty good job of like trying to kind of turn the tables on the liberal media or whatever.
In between getting punched, obviously.
Well, and this was, and I started following him even before that. Ironically, the funny thing is that, I wish I had been archiving some of these podcasts and stuff like way earlier than I ended up archiving them. Because there are podcasts that were recorded. There's one recorded right after that incident where he talks about, I've been silly stringed many times before, but I've never actually been punched. And he's like talking about, it wasn't that bad, etc. But, I wasn't archiving the podcast at that point, and I deleted it when I was finished listening to it. And now that whole, like that, all that's been, down a memory hole. Because as these guys lose their hosting providers, they tend to not like put up their old material again. And so unless somebody just has it, it's gone. It's kind of one of the real negative things about deplatforming these guys, is that like it's harder for me to track them. It really makes it easier if you could just like put them on like iTunes. It would be really easy for me to follow them. But I'd rather that not be the case, So
I would sort of put out an appeal to our listeners. If any of you have all this stuff backed up, get in touch with Daniel. But I'm pretty sure you're the only person from the left doing this.
I'm pretty sure I have a larger archive of this stuff than almost anyone out there. I'm in contact with other people who are kind of tracking it as well, and I kind of comparing notes. And I'm pretty sure, because I've been archiving pretty completely since around Charlottesville, actually a little bit before that. And I try to just grab whatever archives I can, and I'm pretty sure I have stuff that literally no one else has at this point.
So, I don't want to get sidetracked. So, on the subject of Spencer, I mean, what is
Well,
his
so
ideology?
the interesting thing for me is that if you look at the history of Spencer's sort of like after 2010, but before like 2015, in that kind of 5 year period, he kind of went nowhere. In fact, even the sort of alternative right label, um, he kind of stopped using it. He got this job at the NPI, the National Policy Institute, and he kind of moved away from doing those kind of campus events, and he went away from kind of using that label just because it just kind of wasn't very effective. A couple of buddies of his, who were kind of involved from the beginning. I don't have their names in front of me right now, but a couple of buddies kind of took over the website, and they were just kind of kept publishing this little webzine that might as well have been, I mean, there are plenty of kind of right-leaning little web projects that have a few thousand readers or whatever, and they just kind of keep going by luck and by plug, and it was just kind of one of those. And interestingly, the term seems to have kind of like that fact that Richard Spencer was not sort of directly associated with it, and that it wasn't explicitly a kind of white nationalist term for a while, seems to be the thing that allowed it to sort of be embraced by the sort of the edgy right. And it seems to be they just sort of embraced it as a term, and so that's where sort of Breitbart and Milo and a lot of those kind of figures started calling themselves alt-right around this kind of 2013 to 2015-ish period. And in fact, in 2015, basically up until the 2016 election cycle, I mean, the term alt-right was very it was this kind of catch-all term that kind of included everybody, and they all sort of like embraced it as something that they were just kind of all kind of moving under this one banner. It just kind of meant edgy right-winger. And that could be anybody from sort of a center right libertarian all the way to like gas the Jews. It seemed to be kind of everybody kind of working together. And it was really only after the sort of election and only after this event, Heilgate, which is the after Trump's election, but before his inauguration, Richard Spencer gave a speech at one of the Washington D.C. Ballrooms. I forget the name of it, but the Atlantic had a reporter there, and they shot some video. And Richard Spencer, and this is a really fascinating speech. I'm going to go through this like bit by bit as part of the pieces of writing I do. I mean, it's a really fascinating in terms of like what it tells you about Spencer, and about like kind of where this movement is. In a lot of ways, it's as important, if not more so, than the original Paul Gottfried piece. But what's really interesting there is, or what kind of like bit him all on the ass was, Richard Spencer is kind of lording it over that like suddenly we are the ones in charge, and he's using terms like Lugenpresse, and he's kind of really openly kind of rubbing it in that oh no, we're actually going to have this far right racialist ideology that's going to be in charge now, and Trump is sort of the vehicle for that. But also a bunch of people in the back, after the speech, were giving the Roman salute there, the Heil Hitler salute, and the Atlantic cut together this like 2 minute piece of video that's sort of like the highlights or the lowlights of Spencer's speech, alongside this kind of dark intoning music, and then some people throwing those Roman salutes. And suddenly all the alt-right figures who did not want to be associated with outright neo-Nazism really distanced themselves from the term. And so after that, alt-right was very much more a that kind of openly racialist white nationalist term. And really, in fact, the Unite the Right rally, I mean, the original point of that was to sort of like combine everybody back into one thing again, which became a total complete failure for a lot of reasons. But Spencer is, so you asked me what he believes, and Spencer is an interesting figure in that sense, in that he believes in sort of a racial that white people are genetically superior, or at least different from other people, and that white people, because of sort of inherent genetic advantages, have built civilization around themselves, and like that we as white people, as he would say, made this and like all the other people in the world, like black people and East Asians, etc., are not have not been able to do that, and they that colonialism is good because then suddenly Africans get access to this amazing thing that white people can make, and because black people are not able to build this for themselves, and isn't it beneficial for white people to just control them? Richard Spencer is an open colonialist. I have some audio of him talking
Yeah,
about this in not uncertain terms.
I was going to say, go back even 100 years, and that's a completely standard mainstream set of
Right,
ideas.
exactly, and I think that what one of the interesting things is that they do kind of openly embrace this idea that this is what this is what our grandfathers believed was just natural and right, and therefore and this has all been subverted sometime in the last 60 or 70 years by certain people who have parentheses around their names to convince us that this is not right and natural. I mean, he believes that it's with him that really this kind of idea that the ethno-state, he didn't invent the term ethno-state, that derives back from the I think the 80s, the 70s or 80s. You kind of started seeing people kind of using that terminology explicitly, but certainly he's the one on sort of the alt-right. He's the one who's really kind of thinking in terms of that big picture, in terms of saying like what we need is to re-embrace a sense of our destiny as white people to make things for ourselves and to rule by will and to not feel guilty about the things that we might have done in the past to other people, and that this is just sort of right and natural and good, and that we need this sort of ethnic identity in order to move forward as a people, and that ethnic identity being subverted is what's the root cause of sort of the weakness of kind of modernity. It's very much a direct rejection of modernity in ways that feel very similar to what sort of the neo-reactionaries are like, but with certain slightly different valences. I mean, there is some kind of interesting overlap there, but it is, in Spencer, and he has serious academic credentials. I mean, two of the things that really differentiate Spencer from a lot of the other figures in this movement is that he has serious academic credentials. He has a master's degree from Duke. He was working on a PhD until he kind of entered politics more directly. And he is actually a son of like very, very wealthy family. Most of the other kind of figures you end up being kind of like I hate using class this way, but sort of the upper middle class. Grew up in a suburb somewhere, and dad was in the tech industry basically.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the other figures look a lot more like that. Spencer is actually a blue blood, like his family line. I mean, they owned plantations in Louisiana, I believe. And he still has I think some family down there. I think he owns their there's a bunch of sort of like where Richard Spencer's family comes from, and there's a lot of conspiracy mongering on the alt-right about like Richard Spencer's really Jewish, etc. I mean, there's a lot of that going around as well. But what interesting, and again, the thing that kind of gets me about Spencer is that he does have this very big picture view. I mean, he is not interested in sort of like local races. He's not interested in things like who's controlling the House this cycle, or I mean, he's interested in that in terms of being able to sort of push ideas, but he's not interested in sort of the details of policy. He's interested in sort of creating that vision and doing very, very big picture kind of a viewpoint. He's thinking in terms of centuries and not decades, if that makes sense. Whereas a lot of the other figures, I mean, if you do kind of follow this movement, a lot of them are doing sort of like the day by day, kind of looking at what Trump's doing, here and now, and a lot of the sort of day to day politicking. And Richard Spencer, I mean, he does a bit of that, but even on his own, like when he's kind of hanging out with his buddies, and kind of doing stuff that's sort of branded alt right, as kind of his personal brand. It feels like he's definitely trying to not get caught up in sort of the minutiae of the day to day. Like he finds it just kind of beneath him. And that's another thing, just personality wise. I mean, he just bleeds this, sense of like kind of natural superiority to other people. He's really disgusting when you kind of see kind of behind the scenes footage of him, kind of the way he talks to the people around him. I mean, he sees himself as just inherently superior, because he comes from wealth, because he looks good in a suit, because he actually drinks very mediocre bourbon. But I'm kind of amazed at some of his bourbon choices. If I had his budget, I would drink better than he does. But anyway, that's neither here nor there.
So I was going to ask about his funding. Does does he fund himself, or
The funding of this stuff, like, honestly, if there was one question I would love to get, like, if I could get really concrete answers on where this money comes from, that would be the thing that I would. That's a really big open question, honestly. It's sort of like, and this is movement wide, because they are very reticent to sort of give out any information at all about, like, where their money comes from. My understanding is that Spencer, like, just kind of has personal family wealth that he's able to use. That there are quite a few sort of millionaires, not billionaires. Like, they're not getting sort of like Koch brother money, but there are people who are sort of like known as donors, who will sort of make small donations of only like $20,000 or so to sort of fund these projects, and that's where a lot of the just kind of the nationalist right, this kind of alt-right, this explicitly race realist right, gets a lot of their funding through those kinds of sources. That there are people who have enough money to be able to drop it in a few $1,000s at a time, but not actually sort of creating foundations that will be self-sustaining the way that sort of movement conservatism is able to do. And this is, again, a source of a lot of that resentment. Like, Richard Spencer thinks he should have some billionaire giving him all the money he wants, and he doesn't. And that resentment is, very, very clear in a lot of these guys, that they can't, that Richard Spencer has to kind of balance grape in a way that, like, say, Ben Shapiro doesn't. Ben Shapiro has an actual institution behind him that will pay him and researchers and graphics and all that kind of whereas Spencer has to kind of do it by himself in his really nice apartment in Alexandria, Virginia.
yeah?
He's
There's
not missing meals here, but he doesn't have access to the kind of funding streams that he thinks he should. And again, this is all over this movement. Like, they all think they should be making way, way more money.
There's always a question of form following function, or the other way around with this, because you wonder if he, partly why he's not getting more money from more quote unquote respectable sources, is going to be that he's got this profile as somebody sort of beyond the pale. But at the same time, if he was getting more money, he'd be able to set himself up to look respectable, and he probably wouldn't be beyond the pale anymore.
Oh no, absolutely, and again, Richard Spencer has been really clear from the beginning, from the get-go. Again, if you look at sort of interviews he made to the Atlantic, called the Atlantic, right after the Highgate, in that same like package of interviews, he has been very explicit about, like, the whole thing that we're trying to do is to move the Overton window in our direction. We are trying to move the realm of acceptable discourse towards us, into where we can say, we just want to make a state for white people. We just want to be working in favor of white people and white people only. And again, very open about that. But the whole point is that because he's kind of on the edge of that, he's not able to sort of get that kind of institutional support. But he's actively trying to make it to where he can. That's the whole point. Also, I think that there are, and this is kind of where some of the some of their own kind of conspiracy mongering comes from, like, kind of real places, because one of the most powerful lobbies in in DC is AIPAC, the Israeli lobby, and the Israeli lobby is obviously not going to give money to Richard fucking Spencer for many reasons. And so the fact that AIPAC won't fund these guys, the fact that, like, the Jews control all these kind of neoconservative funding sources, that sort of, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? Like, they won't fund us because we want to throw them into ovens, or it's complicated exactly how they feel about what they want. We want to ship them all back to Israel, essentially, is sort of the mainstream opinion on I think that would be Spencer's perspective, is like, they should go live in Israel instead of be here. But
Well, it always is at the
that
start. I
feeling
mean,
that
that's
there's
what the
all.
Nazis said at the start.
Oh no,
We'll
no,
deport them.
absolutely. Yeah. I'm trying to be clear about what I mean, and also
Yeah.
not get us sued by one of these guys because I made a joke. But clearly, yes, no, they say yes, we want to like export the Jews to Israel. We want to just get them. We want they have their own country. They should go live there and not subvert our society. But from somebody like Spencer's point of view, whenever he tries to go and get like kind of real institutional money, there's always some Jew saying no, and that definitely feeds into that same persecution complex,
Well, I think
because then it's like, oh, the banks are all controlled, the credit card processors are all controlled by the Jews. It's not like, no, people find your views really repellent, and they just kind of don't want to be associated with you for complicated. No, it has to be this like group ethnic identity that the Jews are ganging up on me. It's completely absurd, and it's like absolutely pervasive in this movement.
yeah, because paranoia is one of the animating forces. Um, yeah, on the subject of anti-Semitism, uh, I think there's a book by George Hawley, Making Sense of the Alt-Right.
That is an
I
excellent book. That is an excellent book.
Yeah, I haven't read it, but I read the review of it by Noah Balatsky, and he interviewed Hawley, I think, and he talks about how the big dividing line in American conservatism after World War II was anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism was kind of, well, I won't say purged because I think that's giving them too much credit, but the line was that it had to be eliminated from American conservatism. And you have William F. Buckley famously, viewing that as the main task of the respectable right in America, and
Well,
anathematizing Pat Buchanan and stuff like that.
anti-Semitism became completely associated with the Nazis and the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And I mean, this again, this again comes right back to sort of the centrality of the Holocaust and sort of justifying some of this ideology. It's like, well, again, I'm very cognizant of like you could sort of like cut some of this out and make it sound like I'm saying this. I obviously don't believe this, but the sort of the animating myth of well. After World War II, the Jews used the stories of the Holocaust, whether it was real or not, to browbeat ordinary white people who, ethnic Europeans, so Anglo-Saxons or, Germanic people, whatever, to act against their sort of ethnic group cohesion by accepting more and more Jewish people into society. And once the Jewish people were allowed to take positions of power and authority over white people, they basically ran the country into a ditch by then allowing African Americans to have expanded rights to vote, and the Hart-Celler Immigration Act in 1965, which changed the sort of racial makeup of what was allowed to be like immigration into the country, and sort of light and on and on and on. I mean, it's like the Jews took over, and suddenly we had all these like quote unquote mud people in our country, and it's all with the explicit goal of removing white people from quote unquote white countries, and this it's the white genocide myth. It's exactly,
Mm-hmm.
and I mean, and again, you can hear these guys. They will put it in almost exactly these terms.
Yeah.
It's interesting that I don't think I've ever sort of heard Spencer himself really kind of like put it this explicitly, but I think he believes it. I don't have any doubt that he believes it. I think he's just slightly cagier about he doesn't talk much about the Jews. I was actually thinking about this as we were planning to record. I'm not sure if Richard Spencer believes in the Holocaust or not. I'm legitimately, I don't think I've heard him discuss it one way or the other.
Well, if
But
he
this is the animating myth. This is the central like idea that they believe.
Mhm. Well, this I mean,
But
my reading.
and just to be clear, there's some truth to the idea that after World War II, basically Americans and kind of Western, European country, Western societies in general, recoiled at how terrible the Holocaust was, and that became a rhetorical tool in terms of making life better for ethnic minorities within Western countries. Like for instance, a lot of lynching legislation kind of went into effect after the horrors of the Holocaust were revealed, and it was certainly it was certainly used as sort of like, this is the really bad version of this, and we don't want this to happen, and
Yeah.
returning American GIs, saying like, no, we fought those Nazis, and we're gonna be not racist by, and
Yeah.
we're gonna be better people. And there's something, I mean, there
No,
is something kind of admirable in that. Like, yes, you
yes,
saw how
absolutely.
bad things can get, and that's good, but like, because there wasn't like a sort of real left material basis to a lot of it, it just kind of turned into, well, yeah, we changed the laws, that's all we needed to do, right? And this is where the kind of the complicated, like, is this, to what degree is Richard Spencer kind of really speaking for this sort of mainstream belief that people just kind of hold underneath, or in what degree is he actually, he would describe himself as sort of a dissident within American politics,
Yeah.
and of
Yeah.
course that's a whole other kind of complicated about, like, what do we mean by white supremacy, and kind of complicated issues there, around the way the rhetoric works. But
Hmm.
yeah.
No, I mean the whole the sort of founding myth you just outlined, that is, let's be in no doubt whatsoever, poisonous bullshit. But like a lot of poisonous bullshit, you can find bits and bobs in there that are based on truth distantly. Like, it happens to be, for contingent historical reasons, it happens to be the fact that Jews in America have tended to be politically liberal. Um,
Hmm.
for pretty obvious reasons, really, because they've been a historically oppressed and persecuted minority, so they're going to identify with other oppressed and persecuted minorities, despite the fact that they're white, um, generally speaking. And then you have the question of Israel becoming a major American uh, ally in the Middle East after the '67 war, I think it was. And you have a group of people quite well off, Jewish liberals and conservatives, who realize in that atmosphere that they can do very well for themselves by aligning themselves with Israel, because being loyal to Israel is now no longer something to be scared of in terms of the old dual loyalty charge. It's now a kind of a good thing. You can boast about how patriotic you are via being behind Israel. So you have, I mean, they're not doing it because they're Jewish. They're doing it because they're opportunistic chances, but they're using this set of circumstances. So you do have
Right,
sort
and
of,
then politicians use sort of like rhetoric around Israel to justify things like Mideast, interventionism,
Mhm.
which is ultimately about controlling like oil revenues, and sort of stamping down populist movements, left movements, and I'm assuming you know far more about sort of the late 20th century history of Middle East, wars than I do necessarily, but certainly, Israel gets used as a sort of like intellectual justification. Oh, it's the one democracy in the Middle East, and they're surrounded by these sand people. I mean, I don't
Mm.
want to use the language, but like, essentially that's what plenty of otherwise quite respectable people will essentially say that in private, although they may not say people there. But of these like savages surrounding Israel, and Israel is this like cosmopolitan modern state. It's a democracy, and therefore we have to defend it, because and it becomes the intellectual justification for what's ultimately just a power play. But people, and people like Richard Spencer, don't they see it as, they don't see that it's just sort of the fig leaf covering a naked excuse for power. They see it as, in some sense, a real um, a real expression of like an ideology that's causing these things to happen. And therefore, that's where you get things like the Zionist occupied government. You hear like Zog, and that dates back to the '70s actually.
Yeah, and because the fascist viewpoint is um, intensely racial. I mean, it conceives the world in racial terms. So they look at this, contingent, contested, messy history about Israel and America forging an alliance with Israel to have an ally in the Middle East so they can contain Arab nationalism, to do with controlling oil and oil supplies and stuff like that. They see that, and a group of people who are quite well off, who happen to be Jewish, rising in the establishment, and then the fact that you have, APAC and all this messy contingent history. They see it in terms of races. So all they see is a bunch of Jews controlling the world as they see it. And again,
Exactly.
It can't be said enough. This is toxic bullshit.
Right.
But
And
they
and you
reify it
find
down to peoples.
and you find that same rhetoric. I mean, if you watch, my YouTube recommendations, most people would not like to see what my YouTube recommendations look like.
No,
Just
no.
to make it clear, for a while I was getting
the algorithm's pretty bad anyway, but with you,
I mean, I actively go and like search like other things just so it's not literally just, like ironically, it mostly gives me things that I'm interested in seeing, but not for like the reason that, not because I think this is good, but because it's worth like knowing. But
you're the one guy that the algorithm works for just because research purposes.
Just for research purposes, right? Although it doesn't tend to push me further right, it tends to kind of push me to more of the same, meaning that I've pretty much found the right wall of what the YouTube, like what is allowable on YouTube. It's sort of like
you found the edge.
I found the edge, yes, and it's a scary edge. But for a while, YouTube was actually recommending actual 1930s, like Nazi propaganda, 30s and 40s Nazi propaganda films. And so if you watch some of those, I don't speak German, but if you watch them, with subtitles and I have not like spent a whole lot of time on it, but I mean a lot of these things, it's the same rhetoric. I mean, they're films that were basically they'd look back to World War I and they'd say, oh, there's this group of people that didn't really suffer the way that the rest of us did during World War I and during the kind of Weimar days and are not starving. And look at these wealthy Jews. They've got diamonds and they've got money and they're not hungry and they're subverting our society. And I mean, again, it's the exact same logic. It's the exact same rhetoric. And I mean, and that's the stuff when you do find those kinds of direct parallels, it's something I'm used to at this point. But certainly when I first kind of started running across some of that, like that's the like chill the blood kind of stuff for me. When you can look at something, when you can literally like pull rhetoric, change the word Germany to America and a couple of other words around, and you just plop it right back in and then see, some 22-year-old chud on YouTube like repeating that exact same thing to 100,000 views. It's scary. It's legitimately scary.
Getting back to Spencer, from the description you've given so far, he's he's a well-off, privileged young man who enters.
I mean, although he's now 40, but yes, young man.
Well, I'm sort of
at the time, yes.
I'm telling a story here. He's a privileged young man from a wealthy background who finds his way entering politics as a career, the way a lot of these guys do, and he seems to have entered that sphere with pre-existing extreme right views. Would you say that's right?
Oh yeah. No, I think he always kind of had this at least implicit white nationalist kind of ideology. The earliest stuff I see from him, anything from anybody who kind of knew him back in the day, I see no indication that this was something that just sort of like came to his mind in 2008 or whatever. Like it feels like it was kind of always a part of his ideology. He was always in that, but ensconced within sort of that far right version of PaleoConservatism, as opposed to sort of an openly National Socialist or kind of openly genocidal.
So he enters the sort of semi-respectable political sphere with pre-existing hard right views, finds himself in essentially a sort of eccentric cul-de-sac, which is what paleoconservatism is by that point, I would say. Right. Sort of experiments with breaking out into the, as I say, the mainstream adjacent by, getting into the Ron Paul thing, because libertarianism, paleo-libertarianism, it's so adjacent to paleoconservatism that ideologically it's almost identical, as we've talked about in the past. And then it sounds like he kind of gives up and then takes advantage of the fact that this phrase he picked up from this Gottfried guy, alt-right, gains traction in the result of events out in the world that he really doesn't have anything very much to do with. It just sort of happens while he's not looking. And from then on, it's a matter of, it looks to me like sort of escalating opportunism. Would you say that's a fair enough summary?
Certainly, if you're kind of and a lot of these it's kind of a lot of the sequence of events I'm still not clear on, because some of it
Hmm.
is kind of contested, and you get kind of sources that kind of go one way or the other. Again, you mentioned Hawley's book. I have my issues with Hawley's book. Hawley is sort of a guy who leans right. At least I believe so. We are kind of mutual follows on Twitter. I have not like spoken to him privately or anything. And but I believe he probably would consider himself kind of a vaguely Republicanish kind of guy. And he so I have my issues with him, certainly politically, but he is definitely able to sort of articulate some of the inner divisions of these movements in ways that I've seen no one else do. And then for that reason alone, I highly, highly recommend that book. A lot of the information that I've kind of gotten, a lot of my kind of perspective on this has come from that. But a lot of the details of like what was actually kind of going on between like 2010 and 2015, I'm kind of unsure of, and a lot of it I've kind of gotten just from sort of listening to it and kind of reading other materials that were produced, like kind of talking about Spencer, like references to Spencer on other shows that were recorded in like 2014 or something like that. So
Mm.
I'm there. There's a lot of kind of like kind of figuring out kind of exactly where he lands there. But I think that I think that you've basically got it right. I think that's really certainly my perspective of him, is that he was kind of just between 2010 and 2015, he was kind of just like kind of looking for his place, and the fact that alt right kind of rose to prominence just in sort of these online spheres, pushed by kind of troll armies as much as anything. That this sort of like basically this sort of like misogynist Gamergate, manospherean kind of movement, started using this term alt right, and he kind of took advantage of it.
Mm.
And it's difficult to know exactly what's going on in his head and what his sort of long-term plan for himself is. I mean, he very briefly planned to run for Senate, I believe Senate in Montana, right after the Trump victory, like when they were all riding high
Yeah.
in that kind of 2 month period between the Trump election and the inauguration. There was certainly, I mean, you can find a couple of news articles from the time, so this is confirmed, but he was going to run for I believe Senate in Montana, and sort of like take over that seat and kind of become a politician. Although in other places I've seen him kind of talk about how that's kind of beneath him. He doesn't really care about sort of the mechanics of like state level politics. He's interested in sort of the national and international perspective on things. So, but yeah, no,
Oh
I
yeah.
think that's a
Yeah.
very accurate you know portrait of kind of who he is. He's just kind of he's just kind of got the bull by the tail a little bit.
Yeah.
There's a sense of he's kind of bouncing around, and in fact, like right now, he's like he just recently kind of took over like kind of running this YouTube channel called Heel Turn, which I kind of know about. I mean, it's this very kind of a run of the mill nothing YouTube channel when I first kind of discovered it. It's just sort of like these kind of guys on the internet, just inviting these kind of white nationalist figures to come on and do live streams. And now that's kind of where he's putting a lot of his focus is in. He's not even really focusing on sort of the alt-right brand. Like he hasn't released in one of his podcasts in months at this point. He's really doing these live streams on YouTube and kind of embracing that audience, which is definitely a way of the fact that he's able to sort of like toe the line enough to not run afoul of the YouTube content moderation, allows him to reach a much much larger audience than he could producing just a podcast that's branded alt right.
Mm. Well,
He
I will
did. He had
say
an
YouTube
attempt to do.
gets them get away with a hell of a lot, but
Oh no, it does, and one of the big stories is one of the big stories of really kind of the last year of 2018 into 2019 now. One of the really big stories is that these guys have kind of figured out how to not get banned from YouTube, and a lot of that is literally just like not using certain words,
yeah, yeah.
to not and they'll change like in the N word they'll change the G's to B's and say nibba, and literally like that's enough. Like you can literally say, I think all the nibbas should hang from trees, and that's perfectly acceptable apparently according to YouTube. It's it's pretty disgusting, but it really is this kind of legalistic approach, and they've become very successful at doing that. But I mean, the irony being that Richard Spencer, who's hypothetically this kind of big blue blood, wealthy intellectual guy with serious academic credentials, is running a kind of what I would consider to be kind of a no-name YouTube live stream with just
Yeah.
sort of guests jumping on and off, and yet he's decided to do that. I think it's, I mean, it's, again, Spencer himself is kind of a mess of contradictions. I mean, he really, and this is kind of why I feel like I don't necessarily have like a really clear picture on like exactly what he's trying to do at any given time. But I think maybe you're right. I think maybe he is just sort of opportunistic and just kind of taking whatever's available to him at the time and just kind of using it for his own agenda until it doesn't work anymore, and then he kind of leaves it behind. That does sort of make sense.
That outline, that I just sort of improvised, that's a fairly classic sort of, fascist origin story, if you like. I mean,
Yep.
there's several fairly classic sort of variants on the fascists' origin story. One of them, of course, is to start out being, on the left, a socialist like Mussolini. But that's the one I outlined. That's very definitely, one
Right.
of them. So it's
Well,
pretty standard.
and the irony is that Spencer, I mean, if you look at sort of like, like to the degree that he has sort of policy presentations, like once you sort of take like race, if you don't consider kind of the ethno-nationalist stuff, I mean, he's, said like, yeah, I'm in favor of universal health care, sure. Like we should have like nuclear power and, green energy and all, I mean, he if you sort of look at him in that sense, I mean, he's very heterodox. He's not a straightforward Republican on a lot of these issues. He's a Trumpist more in terms of his Trump's attitude, Trump's kind of trollish behavior and the way that he pisses off the left, as opposed to sort of really embracing Trump as kind of a real political figure. I think Richard Spencer, and I think most of the larger kind of what I'm just going to keep describing as the alt-right, but you understand what I mean by it, really are not, they really do kind of look down on Trump. They like him. They want him to do what they want him to do, and they think that he should. But you won't find them thinking of him as this sort of intellectual giant or this sort of like amazing politician. I mean, they see him more as kind of a tool that they can use to kind of push their own agenda. Whereas the sort of more overtly Trumpist, kind of online figures, the sort of rah-rah Trump people. I mean, Richard Spencer is definitely not one of those.
No, he's not Ben Garrison.
Right, he's not Ben Garrison or what's his name, Bill Mitchell. The kind of Trump can do no wrong thing. And this also means that they really don't like, none of this movement has any time for like the QAnon stuff, for instance, because all that's kind of based on that Trump is this kind of secret mastermind doing 11-dimensional chess or whatever, and I think this is another thing that I would this is one reason why I find these guys more interesting to sort of follow and kind of try to understand, is that in many ways they have a much more realistic view of the world than sort of the mainstream Republican view of the world, which is sort of based on sort of lies about history, like, oh, America was always this multicultural thing, and like, no, Richard Spencer will tell you, no, America was built on, this kind of like vision of white supremacy and, on genocide, and that was good. That's just what we had to do to get things to happen. And, I don't think that, I don't hold any animosity towards, African Americans, in terms of I want them to go live somewhere else where they can be themselves and build their own society, like that's kind of
how much of that is. How much of that is flim flam, for show, and how much of that is real? I mean, do they genuinely have this sort of disinterested view of ethno-states and racial segregation based on this ideology of race, or is it, how much of it is that, and how much of it is that they just hate black people?
I think, I mean, it varies, I think, from person to person.
Yeah,
I think that there are people. And we can, I mean, it's hard to say whether Richard Spencer is one of these people. I think
he's
Richard
too
Spencer
canny.
He's too canny, and I think he sees, black people as, I think he sees, Africans as distinctly inferior to him, for the reasons we kind of discussed.
I mean, let me clarify. It's a distinction without a
like
difference. It's all hate, but I'm not.
Right,
there's no sense in which one would be better than the other. I'm just interested in it as an academic question.
Sure. I mean, the hate. I mean, I actually don't like framing these things as hate. I find it to be sort of a not useful metric in terms of sort of understanding. I think that, if you listen to them long
I
enough,
mean,
and I
just
have listened to them,
on the level of emotions, it's more about fear anyway, isn't it?
right, and it's more kind of about material conditions, and I mean, it's kind of built around this sort of ideology of, but what they see, what I hear from them over and over again, if you just sort of listen to them talk to each other for hours and hours and hours, which I've done. And I'm not going to talk about sort of Spencer himself here, because it's difficult to kind of know, but they are, it's a very common story that, oh, I grew up in kind of a white suburb, and where everything was clean and things were nice, and the streets were swept, and and things just kind of looked nice. And then I went to the city for college, or I went to and then I had to be around black people for a while. And look, the city is dirty and nasty, and there's crime everywhere, and this, and it's very easy to hear them basically, and it's because of these people, these like human cockroaches, these monkeys, these so many slurs, so much language that I could like reproduce if I was trying to not keep this relatively clean. But there is this sort of sense that, yeah, it's these people doing ooga booga, and they're just kind of dirty and disgusting, and I just don't want them around me. And a whole lot of them, I mean, there are definitely figures for whom it really is just a kind of visceral, like dislike, like almost on this sort of like genetic, I don't want to say genetic level, because that just feeds into the same like racialist, sociobiological ideas that they would love. So I don't even want to use that as a metaphor. But you definitely get the sense that some of these figures, it really is just this sort of like almost intrinsic dislike of being around people who are not white, and in particular people, dark-skinned people of African descent. And the darker, the worse it is. And Australian Aborigines, those are the other people that they really find just physically disgusting and off-putting. And it does seem to be just this like gut instinct level that they seem to respond to that. Spencer doesn't strike me as that. He just strikes me as someone who sees like himself as being superior and everyone who looks more like him. I mean, I find interesting. He did the British journalist Gary Young. I'm sure you know him. He did a documentary. He interviewed Spencer, and he shows up at one of the NPI conferences, and he had been driving, and he kind of shows up, and he's wearing a t-shirt, and he's a journalist, right? But he had like a little bit of sweat on him or whatever. I mean, it's Washington D.C. I think it's July or something like that. And Spencer comes out, and he's clearly had a couple of bourbons in him, and if you listen to his voice, he's clearly, he's been, and he just thinks this man is disgusting, and because he's black, because he's overweight, because he's sweaty, because he's not like dressed nicely, and he really just dismisses him. I mean, he talks down to this, to Gary, a man. I mean, I don't know Young, too well, personally. But I follow him on Twitter, and I find him to be a perfectly like reasonable human being.
He's a nice guy. He seems to be about as good as mainstream journalism gets, I would say.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, he's certainly asking the kind of appropriate questions of Spencer, and certainly at least as bright as Spencer is in that moment. And yet Spencer just
considerably
absolutely
more so.
Right. And Spencer just he dismisses it completely. And it's based purely on this sort of like physicality, on this purely, well, he's slovenly and fat and black, and like quite black at that, like not the sort of like what they say high yellow, like the sort of again, I don't even want to kind of get into like even talking about like kind of the descriptors they use without some pretty serious
that's another old one. I mean, that's what they used to say.
Oh yeah, they will embrace like very old terminology.
Yeah, that's what they used to say about Jefferson. The rumor mongers would say he had a taste for the yellow.
Right. No, I mean, and they embrace. I mean, it's funny to hear people like say yes, and then we're going to talk about a sort of like this detailed modern genetic evidence, which indicates clearly that the human race is composed of the Negroids, the Mongoloids, and the Caucasoids, and just embrace this like completely outmoded 19th, early
Absolutely.
20th century eugenic language, and then say, oh, and this is completely justified by 20th century and 21st century,
Yeah.
genetics. But,
Yeah.
those people in parentheses will not ever like share this with you honestly, etc.
Completely discredited 19th century imperialist race science that they just insist is verified, despite the fact that it's been, by every reputable scientist, it's been put in the same place as phrenology. They just insist that it's all true and it's been
Or
proven.
or they'll take some like genetic map like from some paper like completely out of context, and then kind of draw on it and go like, yeah, see the gap between like the African DNA and the rest of the world DNA, and it's like, you don't understand the first, like you
Yeah.
really do not but because they've got a graph, and they can manipulate it. And I think a lot of them believe, there's a lot of stuff on this kind of bottom feeder kind of stuff to where they just clearly believe it. And I think some of the other figures are lying and like seem to like kind of be able to communicate clearly enough about this stuff, and
Mm.
that I think some of them are kind of openly misrepresenting stuff, and then just hoping it spreads.
Well, it's one of the
Interestingly,
hardest.
Spencer doesn't use a lot of like genetic, arguments. I mean, he uses more kind of cultural arguments and more, sort of, well, obviously our history tells us that we're just better. I don't think
He's
he
too
has. I mean,
canny.
and he'll
He's
talk
not a
about
fool,
IQ. He'll talk about IQ,
Spencer.
but he won't kind of use. I mean, you very rarely see him make kind of the explicit scientific or pseudoscientific arguments. He just
No, he
doesn't.
doesn't. He doesn't nail himself down somewhere like that. He's pretty canny. He's good at debating people. He's good at presenting himself as Mr. Reasonable. And a
Right.
lot of that is knowing, what not to say outright. So you mentioned that he's doing this YouTube channel now. I mean, what else is he doing now? Is he doing what?
Well,
What is his actual place in the movement? What is the structure of the movement, and where is he in it?
what's funny is that I feel like, again, in kind of late 2016 and 2017, you could kind of point to a handful of people who were, kind of undisputed leaders, kind of thought leaders at least in the movement. And I don't think Spencer is, it's much more fragmented, and that and a lot of that has to do with Charlottesville, like Charlottesville and sort of the repercussions of that. Really had this extreme fragmenting effect, and to where, I mean, I think today I was thinking about this earlier today, like who are the leaders right now, and it's like there's not. I mean, they just sort of have their own little fiefdoms.
Mm.
Spencer is certainly sort of like broadly respected within um, certain kind of threads of the movement. I mean, he's certainly kind of this big name, and I think even people who don't like him will kind of broadly respect him for sort of like what he's done for the white race or whatever. Um, but I don't get a sense that there's sort of like one place where everybody goes for their sort of like information and talking points and stuff these days.
No,
Like,
it's very
you know,
it's very diffuse, isn't it? It's one of its weaknesses and its strengths.
right. I mean, and so what is Spencer's place? I mean, yeah, he's respected by a good, at least a good solid chunk of the movement still respects him. Even if they don't kind of personally like him, they think he's, kind of got his head up his ass or his kind of nose in the air. They think he's
Mm.
hoity-toity, that he's,
Well, they all hate each other personally, don't they?
right.
Um,
No, I mean, and that's something that just comes up over and over and over again, is that these people cannot get along for more than 15 minutes at a time. It's astonishing to see some of the fights that they have. And again, there's always any person of any kind of prominence. There are, always the conspiracy that, oh, they're secretly Jewish. That's always the thing. And like they find some I've seen people kind of do family trees and like, oh, this was his half sister, and like she was a full Jew and she convert, and he's got that awful DNA in him or something. But yeah, no, I mean, I think he still does heel turn. He still goes on the public space, which is JF Gariepi.
oh yeah.
It's another YouTube channel. It's one that's it's interesting, like the number of different kinds of people that JF talks to in any given day, because he seems to really have been able to kind of carve out a space for himself, as kind of one of the sort of like central gathering points. Like everybody seems to kind of like JF in the movement, and you really don't see a lot of kind of negativity directed at him specifically. And I think it's because he's just a really kind of canny operator. I mean, he's in some ways kind of does the same thing you were talking about, Richard Spencer, of kind of knowing what to say and what not to say. He's another guy with sort of real academic credentials, although he was I think he has a PhD in biology, in sort of neuroscience. And so he kind of puts out all the like kind of pseudoscience talking points about genetics and all that kind of bullshit. But Richard Spencer has been kind of regularly on his program as well, which I think I mentioned earlier. And it's kind of a all but in name co-host, or at least sort of he's there often enough to kind of do that. And I think one of the things is that after the sort of public speaking tour ended in Michigan, we had you basically had like kind of a big confrontation, and then Spencer puts out a video like this isn't fun anymore. I'm not Antifa is winning, etc. And kind of everybody clapped and cheered. And my perspective was like he's coming back, guys. He's been doing this for 10 years already. This is not gonna end just because somebody punched him in the face. It's just not gonna happen. It turns out, he was going through a kind of a nasty divorce as well, and that kind of only came out after it was kind of over with. He's got a new girlfriend, who apparently is a liberal, quote unquote. There's been some kind of doxing going on around her, and some commentary about like who she is and all that sort of thing, and I don't know, which strikes me as like kind of slightly unproductive. But he's got a new girlfriend now, and she's kind of appeared on his channel a couple of times and just kind of like said hi or whatever. And he's just kind of a person producing content. But and again, I think it's interesting, not explicitly under the alt-right banner. He does seem to have distanced himself from his old, from the people that seem to be kind of his crew from the old days, like Greg Conti and some of those other guys. It's not that he's not still associated with them, but it does feel like this sort of like the alt-right brand, he's moving away from that slightly, and he's kind of just pushing the ideas through other channels.
But does he?
So, again, he's in kind of a nebulous place. I just don't know exactly what he's going at right now. But I'm still tracking him. Don't be. So yeah, go ahead. What were you gonna say?
No, I was just going to say, I mean, he doesn't have an organization, like the Richard Spencer Party or something like that.
No. I mean, I'm pretty sure altright.com still exists, and I believe he's still working for the NPI, the National Policy Institute. I think he's still kind of like drawing income from that and kind of working on that level. He still writes sometimes, but certainly in terms of like his kind of face out there, I mean, he did kind of step away for several months, for probably like 8 months or so, where, I mean, you barely heard a peep out of him. I think he put out 2 or 3 podcasts just to sort of keep up appearances a little bit. But he really stepped away to where you just didn't see him around much. And whereas in 2017, kind of leading up to Unite the Right, I mean, he was everywhere. He would just kind of go and show up on I follow a bunch of shows, and he would do appearances on pretty much anybody that would have him for a while.
But the trouble, of course, with a high profile is that it kind of paints you into a corner, doesn't it? It
Right.
nails down what you mean to people and how people perceive you.
Right. And I mean, a lot of these podcasts, a lot of these kind of like, alt-right podcasts are literally, it's like you and I recording in a basement, essentially. It's
yeah.
They don't really have any more of sort of an audience or any more of a kind of cultural push than you and I do. But there are there are literally hundreds of these kind of guys doing it, and every kind of little bit helps. But he would show up on a lot of those. Even some of those little guys, he would kind of show up and do a 20-minute interview or whatever. And mostly kind of pushing the same kinds of ideas. But I think it was like sort of having that having that omnipresence. And again, that's something that's changed since Unite the Right, since Charlottesville, is that you see a lot more sort of people kind of deciding who is and is not in their little in-group, and who is kind of trustworthy and not. And I think Spencer is still navigating that space. I'm actually interested to see kind of where this heel turn thing is going, because it does seem like kind of a really weird kind of left turn for him. A heel turn in a way, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it works.
It does seem to be this kind of weird thing, and I'm not sure quite what it means, but I'm still following him, so I'll let you know if I figure it out.
Watch this space. Yeah, no, yeah. I mean, I feel like it's the death of the alt-right was pronounced far too early, and they're clearly in a period of fragmentation, but it's also a period of retrenchment, and they're waiting for the next, like he seized the opportunity when alt-right took off. They're waiting for the next opportunity.
I'm gonna, and again, I am not looking forward to the 2020 election, but I also am. I think that they're going to use a sort of a Trump re-election, or I mean, I can only imagine if like a Trump impeachment happened, that they would really kind of rally together again. Like if they
Mm.
had some, what the whole thing lacks, and this is something that Richard Spencer just has not really expressed interest in being, although I think a lot of people wanted to kind of thrust it on him, was that Richard Spencer was going to be like the leader of of white nationalism. He was going to be that face, and he was going to be like that charismatic figure who could really push it forward. And Spencer himself said he didn't want to be Hitler. He wanted to be Goebbels. He wanted to be the cultural attaché in the ethno state, but he didn't want the job. He didn't want the top job.
I'm fine with him shooting himself. So
Yeah, I really try not to wish death on anyone, but yeah, I would like him to just go away. I was really happy when he wasn't producing, when I just didn't have to think about him for a while. It was really nice for me. I wish they'd all just do that. Just go and live your life,
yeah,
and
yeah.
just stop
Oh yeah, I'm
doing
happy
this.
for them to live if they just go and be quiet. Just go
Yeah,
and be quiet and happy and don't say things or talk to anybody. That's fine.
just turn your microphones off. That's
Yeah,
all.
yeah.
That's what I'm asking. That's it. But yeah, no, it's there was this thought that he was going to be kind of the one big leader that everybody was going to rally behind. But I think he just doesn't. I think he's just not good enough at it. Like he just doesn't kind of inspire that kind of
He
that
he's like
kind of passion in enough of the movement. Like he's too smarmy, and he's too kind of put together but not, and he's kind of too, again, kind of a mess of contradictions. He's not really one of them in the way. Like he doesn't have enough sort of mainstream foothold to really kind of become that. And
mm.
yeah,
Well,
so
he is what he is, because he's not quite the standard issue among his type. If he was, he'd now have Ben Shapiro's job or whatever. He's ended up in this cul-de-sac because he's for whatever reason he's decided to become a fascist, and that goes with certain things, and
right.
you can smell it on them. He's the slickest and the most respectable and the most plausible of them, and he's still, he's a bit odd. He just is. I don't like to psychopathologize this stuff, but these people, they're all a bit odd, and you
Oh
can
yeah.
see it on him too.
And
The waistcoats and the tank tops and the
well, like
weird hairdo and shit. It's
he wears the, like, immaculately, constructed suit,
oh
the
yes, the dapper
$3,000 suit.
Nazi.
He wears the $3,000 suit, but the suit jacket is a size too small. So
Yeah,
whenever he buttons it and he's like marching, then he looks like he's, like he looks like he's wearing somebody else's suit jacket, and then we all make fun of him for that. It's again. I've said massive contradictions a few times, and I don't know that I've quite kind of explored that. But he is just kind of like that. He's there are a lot of different kind of competing impulses. I think that he has this kind of idea of being the next David Duke. Um, but I don't think that he really has the ability to do so. I think if
no.
maybe he had maybe if Unite the Right had not gone the way it went, I think that like he might have been able to kind of build that. But I don't think he has that same kind of like mainstreamist charm. David Duke is someone we should probably talk about at some point.
David Duke is somebody we should talk about. We should probably do an entire episode on just Charlottesville. Unite the Right. But I think we're done for this episode.
I think we can wrap this one up. And
Yep.
Any other details on Richard Spencer, I'm sure we can talk about them in the future.
Okay, that's great. Thanks for listening, everybody. And Daniel, do you know now what you'd like to do for the next one, or if not, I can edit this out.
Well, I mean, it's tempting to just kind of do another figure, and I think David Duke would be an interesting one to kind of talk about that history a little bit and sort of like who he is now, and also he's much funnier to talk about than Richard Spencer. Like this got a little bit dry and a little bit
Okay,
intense.
sold.
David Duke. There are lots of like fun little details about David Duke, and in particular David Duke in Charlottesville, and so I think that might be it's hard to say like, oh yeah, let's do a fun one. Let's talk about David Duke. But I think he is legitimately sort of an interesting figure, and it gets into some of the history a little bit, sort of before it was alt-right, and the way that some of these old figures have embraced the term alt-right and sort of embraced the terminology in some fascinating ways. So yeah, let's just do David Duke next time.
Okay, sold. You heard it here, listeners. Come back next week for us having a fun, amusing chat about David Duke. Until then, goodbye.
I promise you there will be jokes.
Oh, they're all jokes.